First of all, a little bit of background as to why we're tracking short-eared owls. Firstly is the population has declined. We've lost about half of their breeding range over the past 40 years. And they're quite a rare bird. We can sort of see the population range here, ranging between about 600 to just over 2,000 pairs. That's a broad range. That sort of reflects our paucity of knowledge about the birds, but also that the numbers of these birds actually does vary quite markedly. The principal food of these birds is voles, and vole numbers fluctuate across space and time. And short-eared owls have an uncanny ability to actually find where there are local and often temporary hotspots of voles. So in some years, there can be quite good numbers of birds, and in other years, there can be next to none or even none over the same site. So they're very difficult and challenging to monitor. The kinds of places that these birds live in are open moorland, semi-natural grasslands. And we can sort of see from the habitat, from the range here on the left, which is from the latest atlas. This is the breeding distribution around about 2010. We can actually see a few things that are probably limiting these birds and causes to why they might have declined. First of all, we look at the distribution, and it's concentrated on islands, and in this case, it's islands that have voles. Notice island groups to Shetland that don't have populations of voles. There are no breeding short-eared owls there. Similarly, in Ireland, that has no native populations of voles. The birds there are pretty few and far between compared to in Britain. So as well as islands, also moorland and areas that are managed for grouse moors. Now, this is kind of a distribution that we see for a lot of ground nesting birds. Short-eared owls nest on the ground. So species such as waders and other ground nesting birds often show this distribution. Ground nesting birds are prone to predation by ground predators. So their distribution is concentrated in areas where ground predators are scarce, either naturally, as in these insular populations, or through management. One of the key factors of grouse moor management is that they control predators. So this is a distribution that we see for short-eared owls as well as other ground nesting birds. But going back to one of the reasons why we wanted to track short-eared owls, it's been acknowledged quite recently that perhaps one of the greatest threats to short-eared owl populations is our lack of knowledge of even their basic ecology. So 4 years ago, in 2017, we started tracking these birds using satellite GPS tags. Here you can see a solar panel, tags attached to these birds using a harness, aiming to actually find out more about these birds. Amongst our principal objectives was to find out about the habitat use during the breeding season. If we could find out about habitat use at other times of year, that would have been a bonus. And the absolute icing on the cake would be to understand more about the wider scale movements. For example, how do these birds actually find these hotspots of voles, which are often temporary? They've just got this uncanny ability where the vole numbers are there, these birds just suddenly appear, often in numbers, to understand why they could do that. And the implications for the ongoing management of land to maintain suitability for short-eared owls, and hopefully stem or even reverse their current decline. Now, this is an example of some of the data that we're getting from these satellite tags. Each of the fixes we get from the birds, it's once every 3 hours, and the fixes are accurate to 2 to 3 meters. So they're really accurate. So you can pinpoint the kinds of habitats they're using over a landscape. Now, this area is in Perthshire, and there are 3 home ranges here, two breeding ranges here and here, and also one which was occupied in late summer and autumn. A typical home range during the summer is about 200 to 250 hectares. And because of the accuracy of these locations we're getting from these tags, we can identify what habitats they're using within this moorland mosaic of habitat. And here we've simplified it down to show what are on heather by the red dots and what were in the grasslands as shown by the yellow dots. This is what that area looks like from the ground. You can see the heather, which is managed for grouse shooting. You can see the burnt areas of heather on here, and also patches of grass within that heather, and also the grasses around the perimeter. If we actually look at the numbers that have come from this tracking information, we actually look at the availability of the grasses and the heather within this moorland habitat. They're roughly equally available within this general landscape. However, by looking at what the owls are selecting for, they are selecting by far preferentially the grassland areas as opposed to the heather areas. So these owls prefer the grasses to the heather, which has a lot of implications for management of moorland for owls and also for other birds. The reasons they go for the grasses are where the voles are, so they're spending their time doing that. However, most moorland areas can be managed specifically for heather, and they target heather expansion and heather management often at the expense of those grasses. So that's at the expense of the areas that have the voles and at the expense of the areas that the short-eared owls are using. The reasons why the heather is targeted for positive management is mostly because of red grouse. Red grouse, like heather, the more heather you've got more red grouse, and you can make more money by shooting more red grouse on those areas. However, probably arguably a little bit more concerning is that there are a number of conservation initiatives that aim to increase heather. You can get agro-environment schemes that increase heather cover at the expense of grass. And also conservationists often look at moorland and assess its condition in terms of habitat condition, suitability. A score of so-called conservation suitability is based on heather cover and heather quality. If I sort of think about the assemblage of birds that use these moorland habitats, I can really only think of red grouse as the only species that really benefit from heather. We're now getting this data from short-eared owls that shows the importance of grasses, and I think of most of the other birds that include in these areas. For example, there are a lot of curlews, lapwing, a few redshank, windchat, a whole range of other birds, and I suspect if we knew those in as much detail as we've now found out about the short-eared owls, those two would be at least as equally favouring the grassland as they are the heather. So to argue for conservation management in the future, we should be thinking about grassland, suitable grassland structure to support voles and whatever these other species are targeting the grasses for, at least equally as important to the heather. The whole concept of managing grasslands for voles is not new. Here in the Netherlands, we've got examples of arable farmland in which we've got these strips which have been created specifically to encourage voles. In that instance, it was for breeding Montague Terriers, but by creating these, they're also found that they're being used by hen harriers, marsh harriers, and short-eared owls. Also, in the winter, they're using these, but a few birds, few short-eared owls are also starting to breed in some of these lowland farmland landscapes. So you can imagine if we could actually equally have incentives to manage grasslands for voles, not only the uplands, we could actually have them in more of the agricultural lowlands, and we could actually have probably hot spots for predatory birds, vole-eating birds in the lowlands as well as on the moorlands. Using this sort of tracking data, we can actually understand how these birds are used in the landscapes at different times of the season and at different times of day. Now, there's a short-eared owl nest in the rushes in the foreground of this picture. And if you read any good textbook, they'll tell you that short-eared owls fly around in the daytime, as indeed they do, but the area that they fly during daylight hours is really quite limited. By far, most of their activity is night. Despite what you read in some of these books, short-eared owls are predominantly nocturnal birds. Not only are they more active at night, they range much more widely at night time. Not only do they range much more widely, they go up onto the higher ridges, as you can see up here. Now, why do these short-eared owls go up on the high ground at night? Could it be that the voles are more active up there and easier to hunt for? Possibly, but I can find no evidence to suggest that should be the case. However, those high ridges during the daytime are where diurnal predators such as golden eagles hunt. Golden eagles are quite important predators of short-eared owls, go to many golden eagle nests in areas where there are short-eared owls, it's quite common to find the remains of short-eared owls within those nests or nearby. They see them as competitors, and the way they deal with competitors is to simply take them out. So the short-eared owls avoid going up there during the daytime, but they're quite happy to go up there and exploit those areas at night. Interestingly, when the short-eared owls are on this higher ground at night time, we're getting increasing evidence that these lower lying areas are actually being hunted over by the closely related long-eared owls that nest in some of the nearby woodlands. I'm starting to see that this could be a way of how these two closely related species that are exploiting the same food resources, the voles, can actually divide up the resources in this habitat. Short-eared owls are happy down here during the daylight hours, but they go up onto the high ground at night time, and while the short-eared owls are up on the high ground, then the long-eared owls come in during the darkest hours of night to hunt over those areas. They're dividing this resource up by different times of day that they're using it. As we said, this whole area, there's also lots of barn owls in these areas too. I don't know how they actually sort of fit into dividing up this landscape, but it'd be something I would really love to do in future, is to actually get the sort of detailed habitat use by all the predators that use these landscapes. And I think if we've got that information, we'd have a better understanding of how these birds divide up the resources in this area. And it would give us a greater understanding about how a multitude of predatory birds can actually use these different landscapes all at the same time, and would actually inform how we could manage them for a whole diversity of these birds, not just a single species like that. As these birds wander around the uplands, we're starting to learn how they interact and are affected by different ways that these upland areas are developed. For example, wind farms. Mostly they're avoiding wind farms. These few locations that we're getting within the footprint of the wind farm that you can sort of see here is actually when the turbines are not operating, when there's no wind. So when the turbines are not operating, they're not making any noise, and it seems like the owls are quite happy to go into that area. However, as a sort of general principle, it seems to be they're avoiding these areas. So you build a wind farm, which are often on those higher ridges, which these birds use during the night time, then build a wind farm there. It is largely excluded for use by short-eared owls in the future. And the other main land use that's happened quite extensively is afforestation. And indeed, it is sort of planting of trees over the upland areas that's probably responsible for quite a lot of the loss of range over that 40-year period that I said. But here we're starting to see how these birds can actually use some of the plantations. Again, mostly avoiding the slightly older plantations, but they are coming into the younger plots, but specifically going into the unplanted areas. And in some other areas, we're actually seeing that they actually make greater use of the bigger unplanted areas, or the bigger areas of young plantation or young growth areas in the second rotations that use that. And interestingly, it's appearing that sort of where those patches of open ground or very young growth are approaching 200 hectares or more, then the short-eared owls are very happy to use those areas, which sort of could inform us how we could actually manage new forests in a rotation to actually include some of these unplanted areas, or make sure that throughout their lifetime there are areas of extensive young growth in those areas that could be big enough to be occupied by short-eared owls, so these forests could be used throughout their lifetime, rather than they're actually completely relying on grouse moors. We could actually sort of start to think of actually managing forests in the long term for these birds. Now, how do these birds actually use the whole sort of landscapes as they move around, not just within the sort of the breeding areas? So I'm going to talk about this one particular bird that we tagged in May 2017. This background map is central Scotland, and we tagged her while she was on her nest. We tagged her at a nest on the hills of the Oak Hill Hills, just above Stirling, quite literally about 4 miles from where I'm sitting right now. For those of you know, this is the Firth of Forth that you can see coming in, Stirling there. So this is a map of central Scotland. She stayed with her young when they were young, but almost as soon as the young grew and were able to thermoregulate for themselves and didn't need brooding anymore, she left them, and she moved to an area in Perthshire, about 40 kilometres away. Every female that we have tagged so far has left their young at about that stage. They leave the male alone to finish off the chick rearing process by themselves. The females do all the incubation. They do all the brooding. I think they do all the brooding. I don't think the males spend much time, if any time, doing that. And I suspect that takes up all their resources, and they have to sort of move on after that period, leaving the males to do the young, to look after the young to fledging, which the mate of this bird successfully did in that case. This bird moved on to about 40 kilometres away in Perthshire and occupied a range, sort of a few patches of sequential home ranges, but then made the odd exploratory visit some distances away, down towards Glasgow and out towards Glenlyon in the Highlands. Excuse me. Which is really interesting because this area in Perthshire, there was a lot of voles at that time, but still she made exploratory visits. And we're starting to see how these birds might actually explore the habitats to find out what conditions are like. She had a good patch, a home patch with lots of food there, but still made occasional trips elsewhere just to see if there were conditions that were better. And it's quite a secure sort of way to do that, because if you know you've got somewhere that is good enough to go back to, it obviously makes it worthwhile seeing what else could happen. You know, if there's anywhere else that is better that they could move to. The tags are solar powered, and at the end of October, we lost track of that bird at that time. Just simply not enough daylight in these latitudes to carry on transmitting from these tags. However, come the following February 2018, the tag refired and she was still in the same area in Perthshire. However, at the end of March, she made a round trip, basically a 500-kilometre round trip to the north coast, came back through the West Highlands, returned to Perthshire, went back to that same patch in Perthshire, and as soon as she got back, she settled to breed. Again, why? Clearly, she made this journey just before when she was actually in condition to breed. She was settling to breed. Why did she make this journey elsewhere? Maybe it was just to see if there was anywhere better that she could breed. Maybe it's to see if she could find a better mate, while she actually had somewhere she knew was good enough to go back to. Just checking, was there somewhere better to go to? She laid her eggs, chicks hatched, got to the stage that they could thermoregulate themselves, and as before, she left, and she left to the northeast. Again, her mate successfully fledged the rest of those chicks over that period. She carried on across the North Sea, took 16 hours to do that, and then carried on into Norway, did a bit of a U-turn, and then, much to our astonishment, she settled to breed again in Norway. So that she bred 2 times in the same season, 1,000 kilometres apart in 2 countries. This is the kind of place she, or this is actually where she bred in Norway. You can see it is sort of the Arctic alpine shrubland, willows, birch there. It's kind of interesting to see the habitat that is used there. If you actually look at the availability, grassland is actually more available over the whole area that these owls were using than the dwarf shrubs. But in contrast to what they do in the heather, they were using the dwarf shrubs much more preferentially than they were the grasslands. Presumably this diverse structure and actually diversity of species of dwarf shrub rather than just single species of heather actually accommodate the voles that within this area and actually facilitate the hunting of the voles in this area, which makes you wonder if we could recreate habitats like these on our own mountain tops, as would be the case naturally, would those areas become available for short-eared owls to breed in? I think that's an interesting thought. We lost track of that bird in Norway in September, but much to our astonishment, she reappeared in Ireland in October and continued to travel around Ireland. However, towards the end of November, even in the sunny south of Ireland, the tag stopped transmitting. However, come February, she reappeared on Dartmoor. Interestingly, on Dartmoor, her switching behaviour changed. She was actually spending the daytime roosting on the moor at high elevations, and at night time travelled to the lowland farmlands to feed, which kind of shows that these birds can adapt their behaviour depending on where they find them. They can take into account where the food is available, what are the competitive and predation risks, And they've got this plasticity of behavior that they can do that. At an individual bird can change its behavior to accommodate the conditions that it finds itself in as it wanders around, well, the world, basically. We thought she was going to settle on Dartmoor, but no, she went on and moved to the Fens just outside of Peterborough, where again, we thought she was going to settle, but no, she carried on to the North Norfolk coast, then clearly tried to get back to Norway. Fortunately, she got to within a few tens of kilometres of the Norwegian coast, but hit some really bad weather. There were some northeasterly gales at the time, lots of snow, and she veered west, and that was the last we heard from her. And presumably she died at sea after 28 hours flying against the wind in those conditions. So that journey wasn't very successful. We're actually finding that these birds don't actually live that long. So we know this bird had bred in 2 years and actually had 3 breeding attempts in those years. That is actually quite good. These birds have the ability to move around, find good areas to breed, and when they do breed, they can actually lay large clutches and rear large broods. So they don't need many breeding attempts to replace themselves. Basically, they've got a strategy, a lifetime strategy of breeding hard but dying young. It's kind of interesting, though, that while she was here in Peterborough, why she should make this long crossing across the North Sea rather than trying to attempt to get back to Scotland, where we know she had bred successfully in the 2 previous years. As it happens, in this year, 2019, there were virtually no voles in mainland Scotland, and basically virtually no short-eared owls. So did she actually know it was not worth going back to Scotland at that time? And I suspect actually she could have actually done that, because these owls do communicate with each other in a way. They roost communally, and I suspect that they could actually make a judgment call on actually looking at the flight directions of birds, what the body conditions of those birds are in, and decide whether it's actually worth flying in any directions. So basically, you know, if this bird actually saw any birds coming in from the north, from where she was down in Peterborough, if they were particularly lean birds, not in good condition, she could make that judgment call as to actually it's not worth traveling in that direction. So I suspect there's actually a degree of communality here. And if we actually think about each of these individual birds making these exploratory movements when they've got base from their home ranges, coupled by a rather more extensive way of communality and communicating, being able to sort of interpret from the behavior of other birds as to where are the good conditions, or at least which directions are profitable to fly in, or equally importantly, which areas are not profitable to fly in, then you can sort of see how these birds can quite efficiently and easily find these hotspots of voles and food availability as they occur. You can start to understand how these birds have this really fantastic ability to just home in on food supplies as where and whenever they become apparent. Now we've tracked so far 21 of these tag birds, which was actually our target we wanted to do. And this is all the tracks that we've got to date. A number of things to sort of see from this. So actually look at these, we've got a small cluster of birds that we tagged this year in Iceland. It was part of our plan that we wanted to tag birds in different areas with different prey bases and also sort of different predator and competitor bases. We were hoping to do this on a few different islands around Scotland this year. Clearly that wasn't feasible because of COVID. However, we were able to collaborate with people in Iceland for those people there to actually tag 3 birds this year. We're actually finding they're using there are no voles in Iceland, which is also one of the really interesting things. But there, one of the principal prey items are actually wood mice, and the wood mice there are actually larger than our wood mice. They were introduced perhaps with the original human colonists 1,000 years ago, and in that time they've actually become quite big wood mice. So they're clearly sort of quite suitable prey for short-eared owls in the absence of voles. And also from where these birds are feeding and the pellets that have been collected from those birds, young waders and in the winter, even adult purple sandpipers appear to be important prey in those areas. These sort of highlighted points that you can see here are actually the currently active tags, or ones that we expect to be active, bearing in mind that quite a few tags it is now the middle of winter, and most of these tags have switched off now, hoping they'll reappear come the spring. Well, another thing to sort of notice from these birds, most of these birds have been tagged in central Scotland or on the Isle of Arran, is actually the individuality between the birds. Each bird seems to do something very different. Some have gone to Norway for the summer. Some have actually travelled down to North Africa. And this incredible one actually travelled as far east as Russia before travelling down and unfortunately dying just a few weeks ago in Mauritania. So some of these birds are actually doing these long journeys. It's kind of interesting why some of these birds should make these long journeys. Two of them so far we know have died. And this one down in Libya, we actually haven't heard from a few weeks. It might be bad news for her. Just curious why they should actually make those long journeys while other birds are actually remaining further north. Some of them are actually still on the breeding grounds. Why do they make that decision to do that? It's also interesting that sort of a few years ago, we did an analysis of ringing recoveries of short-eared owls. And we speculated there was actually a change in the distances that the birds moved. And it appeared like there was an association with population densities. When population densities were high, these birds tended to migrate further. When populations were low, they tended to stay closer to where they were breeding. In this case, we're sort of thinking, as I said at the start, these populations have declined, but clearly, even from a rather modest sample of just 21 birds, we're starting to see quite a number of movements over very long distances for these birds. So is there something that has the population actually taking a turn and increasing? So first, to answer the question as to why some birds might stay at home and why others sort of move the distances. These are actually winter home ranges. Here's the Isle of Arran, and this is Kintyre on the left-hand side. We're actually finding the winter home ranges are between 3 and 5 times larger what they use in the summer. And remember that each of these home ranges, as far as we know, is occupied by a single bird. A breeding home range is occupied by a pair, and then its young. So come autumn, come winter, there's more birds. There's got young to occupy. Each of the pair needs a bigger home range. So there's actually competition for space in winter. So some of the birds have to move on. When there's high densities, they have to move greater distances, which might explain why some of those birds are actually traveling those greater distances. Just take a look at this sort of one bird that in its winter range, it was actually roosting often at night on the Isle of Arran, then traveling over, roosting during the day on the Isle of Arran and traveling over at night time to feed over on mainland Kintyre, making the journey back in the earliest hours of the morning. Over that period that that bird was there, he'd make that sea crossing a total of 47 times. Really quite astonishing. And coming to sort of why they make these long journeys, does it reflect that the populations have increased? Well, actually, if we look at the latest European Bird Atlas data, actually, these green dots here represent areas where the populations have actually colonized, have actually increased in the past since the 1990s. So it does look like at a European scale has been a recent increase in short-eared owls. So maybe the population, the fortunes of the birds are changing, and this has led to some of those increases in migratory distances that were recorded. Why they've increased in some of these areas, absolutely, I'm not so sure, but it may be to do with land abandonment in parts of Eastern Europe, maybe changes in agricultural subsidies from headage payments through to area payments. So maybe areas are not being grazed so tightly, and there are sort of more voles in some of these areas. It remains to be seen. But I'm sort of delighted to say that sort of following our success with tracking these birds, quite a few of our colleagues in Europe have started studying these birds and actually looking at the behaviour of these birds and using similar tags. We're now getting tagged birds in Spain, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and in the Czech Republic. So as well as we're finding the birds out that we found from our birds that have been tagged in Scotland, over the coming years, we're going to find out a lot more from these birds across Europe. There are also initiatives now in North America where people are starting to tag these birds. So basically, this is sort of a summary. I won't go through it in detail. You can either read this or look at it on the recording and pause it and actually read it in detail to show you. But it shows that what we have actually learnt a lot from these birds tagged in Scotland, and hopefully we're going to learn a lot more from the birds tagged in Europe. Next phase for us is to wait for the tag birds to do what they're going to do, get their data. We've started processing that data, analyze it, put it into the public domain, report on it so that people can use that information for the benefit of short-eared owls and also for the habitats in which they live. And I'm actually thinking for this as a bird that once we actually know what these birds actually need to live throughout the year, they're a bird that will actually find those conditions wherever we create them. They've got this dispersal capability to do that. They're a bird, you create the habitat, you create conditions for these birds, they will find it and they will use it. Probably not every year, but they'll use it when the voles or the prey items are there. It's a bird that we can actually work with very effectively. So finally, just a thank you to the many people who have actually helped over the years, sort of building up this work, and the people who have helped us catch the birds, tag the birds, whole range of people. A special thanks to these three people who've done masses of work to work on these things. And also thanks to people who have funded this work through individual donations. And this is a not so subliminal message to say where you can actually donate in the future to continue our studies on owls altogether. And thank you very much for listening to me.